The blood that ran through Diana Calloway's veins was Mexican and Irish, a combination that made her unwelcome in nearly every corner of Silverton, Colorado in 1878, and she knew the moment she stepped off the stage coach that this town would be no different from all the others that had turned her away. Her mother had been a beautiful Irish woman who fell in love with a Mexican ranch hand in Texas, and their forbidden union had produced Diana, a girl with striking green eyes and rich bronze skin that marked her as neither one thing nor another in a world that demanded people choose sides. When both her parents died of fever within days of each other the previous winter, Diana had been left alone at 19 years old with nothing but a small inheritance and the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast territories of the West she might find a place where blood did not matter more than the person who carried it. The other passengers on the stagecoach had refused to sit next to her during the long journey from Denver, pressing themselves against the opposite side until Diana felt like a leper being transported to an isolated colony. She had tried to make conversation once, mentioning the beautiful mountain scenery, but the well-dressed woman beside her had simply turned her head and stared out the window as if Diana had not spoken at all. That silence had been more cutting than any insult could have been, and Diana had spent the rest of the journey watching the peaks of the San Juan Mountains grow larger on the horizon, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in coming here. Silverton was a mining town that had sprung up almost overnight when silver was discovered in the surrounding mountains, and the main street was crowded with prospectors, merchants, and gamblers, all trying to make their fortunes before the boom went bust. Diana stood on the wooden sidewalk with her single worn carpetbag at her feet, watching the chaos unfold around her and trying to decide which of the several boarding houses might be willing to rent her a room. She had enough money to last perhaps 3 months if she was careful, and she needed to find work quickly if she wanted to survive the approaching winter. The first boarding house turned her away before she even finished introducing herself. The landlady, a pinched-faced woman with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin, took one look at Diana and said the rooms were all full, even though Diana could clearly see a sign in the window, advertising vacancies. The second boarding house was run by a man who looked her up and down with an expression of distaste and quoted her a price 3 times higher than what was posted on his rate card. Diana had turned away from that door feeling her cheeks burn with humiliation, knowing that even if she paid his inflated price, he would make her life miserable with constant reminders that she was not wanted there. She was standing outside the third boarding house, trying to gather the courage to knock on another door and face another rejection, when a commotion down the street caught her attention. A group of men had gathered in front of the saloon, their voices rising in anger, and Diana could see someone in the center of the crowd who seemed to be the target of their fury. She knew she should walk away and mind her own business, but something about the scene held her attention, perhaps because she recognized the particular quality of that anger, the way it rose from prejudice rather than any real grievance. A tall man emerged from the center of the crowd, his hands raised in a gesture that was meant to be calming, but only seemed to inflame the mob further. He was a cowboy, that much was clear from his worn boots, dusty hat, and the way he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with strong features that might have been carved from the mountains themselves, and even from a distance Diana could see that he was trying to reason with men who had no interest in reason. "I told you once and I will tell you again," the cowboy said, his voice carrying clearly down the street. "The horse is mine, bought and paid for in Denver, and I have the bill of sale to prove it." "You are a liar and a horse thief," one of the men in the crowd shouted back. "That is a Spanish-branded mare, stolen from good Christian folk, and we do not take kindly to thieves in this town." Diana felt her stomach tighten with recognition. The brand on the horse was Spanish, and that alone was enough to condemn the cowboy in the eyes of these men, regardless of what papers he might have to prove his ownership. It was the same logic that condemned her, the idea that anything connected to Mexican or Spanish blood was automatically suspect, automatically lesser, automatically wrong. The cowboy pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and held it up for the crowd to see. "This is the bill of sale, signed and witnessed. I bought this horse fair and square from a rancher named Roberto Sanchez, who raised her from a foal. If you have a problem with Spanish brands, take it up with the Denver authorities, but keep your hands off my property. We do not need to see any papers, another man said, stepping forward with his hand resting on the gun at his hip. We know a stolen horse when we see one, and we know what to do with horse thieves. There is a good, strong tree at the edge of town that has not been used in a while. The casual mention of lynching made Diana's blood run cold, and she found herself moving forward before she could think better of it. She had been silent and passive for too long, accepting rejection after rejection without fighting back, but she could not stand by and watch a man be murdered simply because he had done business with someone of Mexican descent. Her own safety seemed less important than stopping this injustice, and she pushed her way through the crowd until she stood beside the cowboy, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "This is wrong," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough to be heard. "You are talking about murder over a horse that this man has proven belongs to him. What kind of people are you, that you would ignore the law and take justice into your own hands based on nothing more than the origin of a brand?" The crowd turned to look at her, and Diana felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. She saw the recognition in their eyes as they took in her mixed heritage, saw the contempt and dismissal that followed immediately after, and knew that her words would carry no weight with these men. If anything, her intervention had probably made things worse for the cowboy, associating him further with the very thing they despised. "This is none of your concern, girl," the man with his hand on his gun said. "Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of and leave men's business to men." The cowboy turned to look at Diana for the first time, and she found herself meeting a pair of blue eyes that were startling in their intensity. He studied her face for a long moment, and she waited for the same rejection she had seen in everyone else's eyes, the moment when he would realize what she was and turn away in disgust. But instead, something shifted in his expression, a recognition of a different kind, and he gave her a small nod that seemed to convey gratitude and understanding in equal measure. "The lady is right," he said, turning back to the crowd. "This is a matter of law and proper ownership, not mob justice. I have done nothing wrong, and neither has the man I bought this horse from. If you want to waste the sheriff's time with false accusations, then let us go find him and settle this properly. Otherwise, I suggest you all go back to your drinking and leave me in peace." The mention of the sheriff seemed to give some of the men pause, but the ringleader was not ready to back down. He stepped closer to the cowboy, his face twisted with anger, and Diana could smell the whiskey on his breath from where she stood. "The sheriff is busy with real crimes," he said. "This here is simple justice, the kind that keeps our town clean of thieves and liars and anyone else who does not belong here." "Clean," Diana heard herself say, her fear suddenly replaced by a burning anger that surprised her with its intensity. "You talk about keeping your town clean as if you are removing dirt, but you are really just revealing your own ignorance and hatred. This man has done nothing to you, and yet you are ready to kill him. What does that say about you? What does that say about this town?" The ringleader's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, and Diana saw his hand move toward his gun. She had pushed too far, said too much, and now she was going to pay the price for her outburst. She braced herself for whatever was coming, determined not to show fear, even if she felt it racing through every nerve in her body. But before the man could draw his weapon, the cowboy moved with surprising speed, placing himself between Diana and the threat. "You want to hurt someone, you go through me first," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This woman is under my protection now, and I do not take kindly to men who threaten ladies." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle, and Diana could see faces in the windows of the surrounding buildings. Some looked entertained, others concerned, but none seemed inclined to intervene on behalf of two strangers. She wondered if anyone would stop the mob if they decided to carry out their threat, or if the people of Silverton would simply watch and then go back to their daily lives as if nothing had happened. A new voice cut through the tension, authoritative and calm. "What exactly is going on here?" The crowd parted to reveal a man wearing a sheriff's badge, his gray beard and weathered face suggesting he had seen enough trouble in his life to recognize it when he saw it. He walked up to the center of the confrontation and looked from the cowboy to Diana to the ringleader, his expression suggesting he was not pleased with any of them. "This man is a horse thief, Sheriff," the ringleader said quickly. "Riding a stolen mare with a Spanish brand, bold as brass right down our main street." "I see," the sheriff said. He turned to the cowboy. "You have anything to say about that accusation?" The cowboy held out the bill of sale, and the sheriff took it, examining it carefully. Diana watched his face as he read, trying to gauge whether he would be fair or whether he too was infected with the same prejudice as the rest of the town. The seconds stretched out like hours, and she became aware of how closely she was standing to the cowboy, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body and smell the combination of leather, horse, and sage that clung to his clothes. Finally, the sheriff looked up and handed the paper back to the cowboy. "This appears to be in order," he said. "Bill of sale from Roberto Sanchez of Denver, dated 3 weeks ago, properly signed and witnessed. Unless you men have evidence that this document is fraudulent, I suggest you disperse and let this man go about his business." "But Sheriff," the ringleader protested, "you cannot trust papers from people like that. Everyone knows they forge documents all the time, claiming ownership of things that belong to honest folk." The sheriff's expression hardened. "What I know is that I am the law in this town, and I have just examined a legal document that proves this man's ownership of his horse. What I also know is that I am looking at a crowd of men who seem ready to commit murder based on nothing more than the origin of a brand. Now I am going to give you all to the count of 10 to clear this street, and anyone still standing here after that is going to spend the night in my jail. Do I make myself clear?" The crowd grumbled, but began to disperse, the ringleader shooting one last venomous look at the cowboy and Diana before stalking back into the saloon. Diana felt her knees go weak with relief, and she had to lock them to keep from collapsing right there on the dusty street. The danger had passed, at least for the moment, but she knew that both she and the cowboy had made enemies today. The sheriff turned his attention to Diana. "I have not seen you in town before," he said, his tone neutral. "You just arrive on the afternoon stage?" "Yes, sir," Diana said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I am looking for lodging and work. I have money to pay my way, and I am willing to do any honest labor." The sheriff studied her face, and Diana saw the moment when he recognized her mixed heritage. She waited for him to make some comment or show the same contempt she had seen in so many others, but he simply nodded. "Lodging is going to be difficult," he said. "Most of the boarding houses in town are particular about who they rent to. You might try Mrs. Patterson on Silver Street. She is a widow who takes in boarders from time to time, and she is less concerned with bloodlines than most folks around here." "Thank you, sir," Diana said, surprised by his relative kindness. The sheriff tipped his hat and walked away, and Diana found herself alone with the cowboy, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Up close, he was even more striking than she had first thought, with a strong jaw, high cheekbones, and those remarkable blue eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses. He appeared to be in his middle 20s, old enough to have experience but young enough to still have idealism, and there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of integrity and strength. "Thank you for speaking up," he said, his voice softer now that the crowd was gone. That took real courage, especially from someone who just arrived in town. Most people would have walked on by and pretended not to see anything. "I could not just stand there and watch them lynch you over a horse," Diana said. "It was not right, and someone needed to say so." "Well, I appreciate it all the same. Name is David Eckhart. I have a small ranch about 10 miles outside of town, up in the valley near Red Mountain." "Diana Calloway," she replied, shaking the hand he extended to her. His grip was firm and warm, and she felt a strange flutter in her stomach at the contact. "I just arrived from Denver looking for a fresh start." I heard you tell the sheriff you need lodging and work. The truth is, I could use some help at my ranch. I have been managing on my own since my partner headed to California last spring, and it has been hard keeping up with everything. The work would be cooking, cleaning, mending, and helping with the animals when needed. Nothing too difficult, but it would be steady and honest. Diana felt her heart skip a beat. Was he really offering her a job just like that after having just met her? She searched his face for signs of ulterior motives, the kind of hidden intentions that some men had when they offered work to women in desperate situations, but she saw nothing but genuine sincerity in his expression. I do not know, she said slowly. We just met and you know nothing about me. Why would you make such an offer to a stranger? David smiled and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more approachable. I know you have courage enough to stand up to a mob, and I know you recognize injustice when you see it. That tells me more about your character than 1,000 letters of reference ever could. Besides, I figure anyone who is willing to put themselves in danger to help a stranger deserves a chance, do not you think? But you do not even know if I can cook or mend or any of the things you would need me to do, Diana said, still not quite believing this was happening. Can you cook? David asked. Yes, my mother taught me. I am quite good, actually. Can you mend? Yes, though I am better at basic repairs than fancy needlework. Can you handle being around horses, cattle, chickens, and the occasional ornery goat? Diana laughed despite herself. I grew up on a ranch in Texas. I know my way around animals. Then it seems to me you are qualified for the position, David said. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. The accommodations are simple but comfortable. I have a small cabin on the property that was meant for a ranch foreman, and it has been sitting empty since my partner left. You would have your own space and your privacy. What do you say? Diana knew she should be more cautious, should ask more questions, should perhaps check with the sheriff about David's reputation before agreeing to ride out to an isolated ranch with a man she had just met. But something in his eyes told her she could trust him, and after the rejections she had faced since arriving in town, his offer felt like a lifeline she could not afford to refuse. I say yes, she said, holding out her hand again. When do I start? How about right now? David said, shaking her hand once more. I have some supplies to pick up from the general store, and then we can head out. The ride takes about 2 hours, and I would like to get back before dark. They walked together down the main street, and Diana was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. She heard fragments of conversation, words like half-breed and Mexican and disgrace, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel alone in facing the prejudice. David walked beside her with his head held high, seemingly unconcerned with what anyone thought, and his confidence gave her strength to do the same. At the general store, the proprietor was initially reluctant to serve them, but David's calm insistence and ready cash eventually won out. They left with bags of flour, sugar, coffee, and various other necessities, which David loaded onto his horse with practiced efficiency. Diana noticed that the mare was indeed a beautiful animal, with a glossy coat and intelligent eyes, and she understood why someone might covet such a horse even if they had no legitimate claim to it. She is beautiful, Diana said, stroking the mare's neck. What is her name? Esperanza, David said. It means hope in Spanish. Roberto told me he named her that because she was born during a particularly hard winter, and her survival gave him hope that he and his family would make it through as well. It is a good name, Diana said softly. Do you speak Spanish? Some, David admitted. I spent several years working on ranches in New Mexico and Texas before I saved up enough to buy my own place. I learned the language out of necessity, but I came to love it. There is a poetry to it that English sometimes lacks. Diana felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and suspicion she had carried for so long. Here was a man who saw Spanish heritage not as something to be despised, but as something to be appreciated, who had learned the language and given his horse a Spanish name despite knowing the prejudice it might bring. She wanted to ask him why, wanted to understand what made him different from all the other people who had judged her based on her blood alone, but she sensed that David was not the kind of man who could easily explain his own goodness. He simply was who he was, and she would have to trust that. They left Silverton behind, following a narrow trail that wound up into the mountains. The landscape was breathtaking, with towering peaks crowned with snow and valleys filled with aspen and pine. The air grew cooler as they climbed, and Deanna was grateful for her shawl, pulling it tighter around her shoulders. David rode Esperanza, while Deanna sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling. She tried not to think about how close they were, about the solid warmth of his body against hers, but it was impossible to ignore the way her heart raced every time the horse stumbled slightly and she had to hold on tighter. "Tell me about your ranch," Diana said, partly to distract herself from her own confused feelings. "It is small but good land," David said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of Esperanza's hooves. "I have about 200 acres in a valley that stays green most of the year thanks to a creek that runs through it. I am running about 50 head of cattle right now, plus chickens, a milk cow, and that ornery goat I mentioned. I grow vegetables in the summer and hay for winter feed. It is not much, but it is mine, and I built most of it with my own hands." "How long have you been there?" Diana asked. 3 years this coming spring. I worked for other people for 7 years, saving every penny I could, before I had enough to buy the land and stock it. The first year was the hardest. I was living in a tent and eating beans and hardtack while I built the main house in the barn. But it was worth it. Every nail I hammered, every board I cut, every fence post I set, they all went into building something that belongs to me. No one can take it away or tell me I do not deserve it because of who I am or where I come from." Diana heard the passion in his voice and understood it completely. She had felt the same way about the small inheritance her parents had left her, the sense that it represented not just money but possibility, the chance to build a life on her own terms. "Where do you come from?" she asked. "Originally, I mean." "Ohio," David said. "Small farming town that was too crowded and too settled for my taste. I wanted space and freedom, wanted to see mountains and open sky. My father thought I was crazy for heading west, but my mother understood. She told me to follow my heart and not look back. She died the year before I left, and I think that was part of what gave me the courage to go. I knew she would have wanted me to chase my dreams." "I am sorry about your mother," Diana said quietly. "Thank you. What about you? What brings you to Colorado?" Diana hesitated, not sure how much to reveal. But David had been open with her, and she felt she owed him the same honesty. "My parents both died last winter," she said. "Fever took them within 3 days of each other. My father was Mexican, my mother Irish. Their families never accepted their marriage, and after they died, I found I was not welcome anywhere. My father's family did not want me because of my Irish blood, and my mother's family did not want me because of my Mexican blood. I have been traveling for months, looking for a place where I might belong, but everywhere I go, people see my mixed heritage and decide I am not good enough for them. Their loss," David said simply. "You seem pretty good to me." The casual way he said it, as if her worth was simply an established fact that needed no further discussion, made Diana's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She blinked back tears and was grateful that he could not see her face from where she sat behind him on the horse. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the trail becoming steeper and narrower as they climbed higher into the mountains. Diana saw deer watching them from the trees, their large eyes curious but unafraid, and hawks circling overhead in the crystal-clear air. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Diana thought that she had never seen anything more beautiful in her entire life. Finally, they crested a ridge, and David pointed down into the valley below. "There it is," he said. "Home." Diana looked down and felt her breath catch. The valley was exactly as he had described, a green basin surrounded by mountains, with a silver thread of creek running through the center. She could see the house, a sturdy log structure with smoke rising from the chimney, and nearby a large barn, a smaller cabin, and various corrals and outbuildings. It looked peaceful and welcoming, like something out of a dream, and Diana felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she could belong. As they descended into the valley, Diana noticed details she had missed from the ridge. The house had a covered porch with rocking chairs, and there were flower boxes under the windows that would bloom in spring. The barn was well maintained, with fresh paint on the doors, and the fences were straight and strong. Everything spoke of care and attention, of a man who took pride in his property and worked hard to keep it in good condition. David helped her down from Esperanza, his hands firm on her waist, and Diana felt that strange flutter again at his touch. She stepped back quickly, not wanting him to see how he affected her, and busied herself with straightening her skirts and retrieving her carpet bag. "Let me show you the cabin," David said, leading her across the yard to the smaller structure. It was built of the same logs as the main house, with a stone chimney and 2 windows with glass panes. Inside, Diana found a single large room with a fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small cook stove, and shelves for storage. It was simple but clean, and someone had clearly made an effort to make it comfortable. There were curtains on the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, and even a small braided rug on the floor. "My partner's wife made the curtains and quilt before they headed to California," David explained. "I kept them clean in case someone else ever needed the cabin. There is a pump outside for water, and the outhouse is behind that stand of trees. If you need anything else, just let me know, and I will see what I can do." "It is perfect," Diana said honestly. "Better than I could have hoped for." "Good. Why do not you get settled in, and I will take care of Esperanza and the other animals. Come up to the main house when you are ready, and I will show you around the kitchen, and we can make some supper." After David left, Diana sat on the bed and let herself absorb everything that had happened. Just that morning, she had arrived in Silverton expecting to face the same rejection she had encountered everywhere else. Instead, she had nearly witnessed a lynching, confronted a mob, met a man who seemed to have no prejudice in his heart, and found herself employed and housed in a beautiful mountain valley. It felt surreal, like she might wake up any moment and find it had all been a dream. But the bed beneath her was solid and real, and when she looked out the window, she could see David leading Esperanza into the barn. This was no dream. This was a new beginning, a chance to start over with someone who had looked at her and seen not blood, but character, not heritage, but courage. Diana sent up a silent prayer of thanks to her parents, wherever they might be, and promised herself that she would work hard to prove that David's faith in her was justified. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her spare dress on a peg and arranging her hairbrush and the small cameo that had belonged to her mother on the shelf above the bed. The sun was setting as she walked across the yard to the main house, her shadow stretching long across the ground, and she paused for a moment to look up at the mountains surrounding the valley. They felt protective rather than confining, like great guardians watching over this small piece of paradise, and Diana felt safer than she had in months. David had lit lamps in the house, and warm light spilled out through the windows. Diana knocked on the door frame and heard him call for her to come in. The interior of the house was as well kept as everything else, with a large main room that served as kitchen and living area, a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, and doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms and storage. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, and there were books on shelves and a guitar hanging on the wall that suggested David had interests beyond just ranching. "The kitchen is over here," David said, gesturing to the area near the cook stove. "Pantry is through that door, and you will find all the dishes and cookware in these cabinets. I usually eat simple meals, just whatever is fast and fills the belly, but I will not complain if you want to get more creative." Diana explored the kitchen, taking mental inventory of what supplies were available and what she might need. There was plenty to work with, and her fingers itched to start cooking something substantial. "How do you feel about beef stew?" she asked. "I noticed you have potatoes and onions in the pantry, and I assume you have beef available." "I have some good cuts in the cold cellar," David said. "Beef stew sounds wonderful. I have not had a home-cooked meal like that in longer than I can remember." They worked together to prepare the meal, and Diana found herself relaxing in the easy rhythm of the work. David was good company, talking about the ranch and his plans for expansion while also asking about her life in Texas and her journey west. He was a good listener, paying attention to what she said and asking thoughtful questions, and Diana found herself opening up more than she had intended. She told him about her mother's herb garden and how she had learned to make remedies for common ailments. She told him about her father's skill with horses and how he could gentle even the wildest Mustang. She told him about the pain of watching her parents die and being powerless to save them, and the even greater pain of being rejected by both sides of her family afterward. David listened to it all without interruption, and when she finished, he simply nodded and said, "You have had a hard time of it, but you are strong. I can see that. Not everyone would have kept going after facing what you have faced. Most would have given up." "I thought about it," Diana admitted, "more than once. But my mother used to say that we honor the dead by living well, and I wanted to honor my parents by building the kind of life they dreamed of for me. A life where I could be proud of both sides of my heritage instead of having to hide one or the other." "That is a good dream," David said. "I hope you find it here." The stew was ready, and they sat down at the table to eat. Diana watched David take the first bite, nervous about whether he would like her cooking, and felt a surge of pride when his eyes widened with pleasure. "This is incredible," he said. "What did you put in this? It tastes different from any stew I have ever had." "Just some herbs my mother taught me to use," Diana said, pleased by his reaction. "Cumin and oregano mostly, with a bit of chili powder for warmth. It is how we made it in Texas." "Well, it is delicious. If all your cooking is this good, I am going to get fat and lazy." They ate in companionable silence, and Diana realized how nice it was to share a meal with someone who appreciated the effort that went into it. She had been alone for so long, eating cold food or whatever she could prepare quickly in boarding house kitchens, that she had forgotten the simple pleasure of cooking for someone else. After supper, Diana cleaned up while David went out to check on the animals one last time before bed. She was drying the last pot when he returned, stamping snow off his boots at the door. "Snow?" Diana asked, surprised. "Just a light dusting," David said. "Nothing to worry about, but it is a reminder that winter is coming fast. We will need to spend the next few weeks preparing, making sure we have enough firewood and feed for the animals. It can get pretty isolated up here once the heavy snows start." "I am not afraid of hard work," Diana said. "Just tell me what needs to be done, and I will do it." David smiled at her, and Diana felt her heart do that strange flutter again. She turned away quickly, focusing on hanging up the dish towel, and told herself firmly that she could not afford to develop feelings for her employer. This was a job, a chance for a new start, and she would not complicate it by reading more into David's kindness than was actually there. But as she walked back to her cabin under a sky full of stars, Diana could not help but replay the day in her mind, lingering on the way David had stood between her and danger, the way his eyes had met hers with respect and understanding, the way his hands had felt on her waist when he helped her down from the horse. She told herself she was being foolish, that she had known him for less than a day, but her heart did not seem to care about logic or caution. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Diana woke before dawn to start breakfast, usually biscuits and eggs and bacon, with coffee strong enough to chase away the mountain chill. David would eat quickly and head out to tend the animals and work on the various projects that needed attention before winter. Diana would clean up after breakfast and then spend her mornings doing laundry, mending, and preparing food for the day. In the afternoons, she often helped David with outdoor work, feeding chickens, milking the cow, or helping to move cattle from one pasture to another. The work was hard but satisfying, and Diana felt herself growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. Her hands, which had grown soft during her months of traveling and uncertainty, developed calluses again. Her skin, already brown, darkened further under the mountain sun. She learned the names and personalities of all the animals, from the milk cow Belle to the ornery goat David had mentioned, whose name was actually Trouble and who lived up to it constantly. But more than the work, Diana found herself treasured her growing friendship with David. He treated her as an equal, asking her opinion on ranch decisions and actually listening to her suggestions. When she proposed changes to the chicken coop that would make egg collection easier, he implemented them immediately. When she suggested planting a larger vegetable garden come spring, he enthusiastically agreed and helped her plan out where it should go. He never once made her feel like hired help or looked at her with anything other than respect and genuine friendliness. They fell into the habit of eating supper together each evening, and those meals became the highlight of Diana's day. They would talk about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures. Diana learned that David wanted to eventually expand his herd and maybe start breeding horses. David learned that Diana dreamed of having a proper herb garden like her mother's, with medicinal plants and herbs for cooking. They discovered shared loves of reading and music, and David often played his guitar after supper while Diana cleaned up, filling the house with melodies that made her chest ache with longing for something she could not quite name. As the weeks passed, Diana began to realize that her feelings for David had grown beyond simple friendship or gratitude. She found herself looking forward to seeing him each morning, watching the way the sunrise lit his face when he came in for breakfast. She noticed details about him that she had no business noticing, like the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, or how his hands, so strong and capable, could be surprisingly gentle when handling a newborn calf or mending a broken fence. She caught herself daydreaming about what it might be like to have the right to touch him casually, to smooth back that wayward curl, or take his hand without needing an excuse. But Diana kept these feelings locked tightly away, certain that David saw her only as an employee and friend. He had never given any indication that he thought of her romantically, and she would not risk ruining the peace and security she had found by confessing feelings that were not returned. She had faced too much rejection in her life already, and the thought of seeing rejection in David's eyes was more than she could bear. What Diana did not know was that David was wrestling with his own confused feelings. He had offered her the job out of genuine need and a sense of justice, but he had not anticipated how quickly and completely she would become essential to his life. The ranch had always been his sanctuary, his refuge from a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, but now it felt incomplete when Diana was not there. He found himself listening for the sound of her voice, looking forward to mealtimes, not because he was hungry, but because it meant time spent in her company. He noticed everything about her, from the way she hummed while she worked to the particular shade of green in her eyes that reminded him of new leaves in spring. David knew he was falling in love with her, and it terrified him. Not because of who she was or where she came from. None of that mattered to him at all, but because he feared she did not feel the same way. She had come to him for safety and employment, not romance, and he did not want to make her uncomfortable or feel pressured. So he kept his feelings to himself, treating her with the same friendly respect he always had, even as his heart ached with wanting more. The first snow of winter came in mid-November, a heavy storm that blanketed the valley in white and trapped them at the ranch for 3 days. Diana watched from her cabin window as the snow piled higher and higher, marveling at the beauty even as she worried about the isolation. On the second day, David knocked on her door and insisted she move into the main house until the storm passed, saying it was foolish to waste firewood heating 2 buildings when they could share the warmth of one. Diana agreed, partly because it made practical sense, but mostly because the thought of spending more time with David made her heart sing. She brought her belongings to the spare bedroom he showed her, a a small but comfortable space with a real bed and a window that looked out on the mountains. That evening, they sat by the fireplace while the wind howled outside, David playing his guitar and Diana working on mending a shirt that had torn. The domesticity of the scene made Diana ache with longing for this to be her real life, not just a temporary situation born of necessity. Diana, David said suddenly, setting down his guitar, can I ask you something personal? Diana looked up from her mending, her heart suddenly racing. Of course. Do you ever regret coming here? To Colorado, I mean? Do you ever wish you had gone somewhere else, maybe California or Oregon, where there are more opportunities? No, Diana said without hesitation. I do not regret it at all. This is the first place I have felt truly welcome since my parents died. Why do you ask? David was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I worry sometimes that you are lonely here. The ranch is isolated and you do not get to see other people or go to town. I do not want you to feel trapped. I do not feel trapped, Diana said softly. I feel safe. There is a difference. David turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made Diana's breath catch. She saw longing there, and hope, and fear all mixed together. And she realized with a shock that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about his feelings. Maybe he had been hiding his heart just as carefully as she had been hiding hers. Diana, he said again, his voice rough. I need to tell you something, but I am afraid it might ruin everything between us. If you want me to stay silent, I will, but I cannot keep pretending that I feel nothing when the truth is that I feel everything. Diana set down her mending with trembling hands. What are you saying? I am saying that I am in love with you, David said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I know I should not be. I know you came here for work and safety, not for this, but I cannot help it. You are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. I love your courage and your kindness and the way you hum while you cook. I love how you talk to the animals like they are people and how you are not afraid to get your hands dirty. I love everything about you, and I understand if you do not feel the same way, but I had to tell you because keeping it inside was killing me. Diana felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. She stood up and crossed the space between them, kneeling beside David's chair and taking his hands in hers. I love you too, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I have been so afraid to say anything, so certain you only saw me as an employee. I never dreamed you might feel the same way I do. David pulled her up and into his lap, cradling her face in his hands. How could I not love you? He whispered. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever met. The fact that you are here, that you chose to stay, feels like a miracle I do not deserve. You deserve everything good in this world, Diana said fiercely. You are the first person who ever looked at me and saw me, not my blood or my heritage, but just me. Do you know how rare that is? How precious. David kissed her then, softly at first, and then with growing passion. And Diana felt like she was finally home, not just in this place, but with this person, this man who had chosen her without caring about the things that had made everyone else turn away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Diana rested her forehead against David's and smiled. What happens now? She asked. Now we figure it out together, David said. If you want to, I mean. I know this changes things, and I understand if you need time or if you want to take things slow. I have had enough of slow, Diana said. I have spent my whole life waiting for permission to be happy, waiting for people to accept me. I do not want to wait anymore. What do you want? David asked, his eyes searching hers. I want you, Diana said simply. I want this life, this ranch, this future we could build together. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to plant that garden come spring and watch it grow. I want everything, David, if you are offering it. I am offering it, David said. All of it. Marry me, Diana. Not because it is proper or expected, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Yes, Diana said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. They stayed up late into the night, talking about their future, and stealing kisses by the firelight. Diana felt drunk on happiness, hardly able to believe that this was real, that she had found not just acceptance, but love in this beautiful mountain valley. When she finally went to bed in the spare room, she could barely sleep, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. The storm cleared the next morning, revealing a world transformed by snow. Diana stood on the porch watching the sunrise paint the white peaks in shades of pink and gold, and felt David's arms come around her from behind. She leaned back against his chest and sighed with contentment. I want to get married as soon as possible, David said. I know the traditional thing would be to wait and have a big ceremony, but I do not want to wait. Is that foolish? No, Diana said. I feel the same way. We have both waited long enough for happiness. Why delay it any longer? The pass will probably be clear enough to get to town in a few days, David said. We can go see the pastor and make it official. Unless you want something fancier, I will understand if you do. I do not need fancy, Diana said. I just need you. They went to Silverton the following week, riding double on Esperanza through a landscape turned magical by snow. Diana was nervous about returning to town, afraid of facing the same hostility she had encountered on her first day, but David's presence beside her gave her courage. They went straight to the small church at the edge of town, where the pastor, a kind older man named Reverend Thompson, agreed to marry them that very afternoon. The ceremony was simple, held in the empty church with just Reverend Thompson and his wife as witnesses. Diana wore her best dress, and David had cleaned up and worn his Sunday clothes. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife and told David he could kiss his bride, Diana felt like her heart might burst with happiness. This was nothing like the wedding she had sometimes imagined as a girl, with crowds of guests and fancy decorations, but it was perfect because it was real, and it was theirs. As they left the church, Diana noticed a small crowd had gathered outside, drawn by word that the cowboy and the half-breed woman were getting married. She tensed, expecting hostility, but to her surprise, several of the faces in the crowd looked friendly. The sheriff was there, and he tipped his hat to them. Mrs. Patterson, the widow who the sheriff had suggested might rent Diana a room, was there too, and she actually smiled. Congratulations, the sheriff said. I hope you will be very happy together. Thank you, sir, David said, shaking his hand. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward and pressed a small package into Diana's hands. A wedding gift, she explained. Just some preserves and a loaf of bread I baked this morning. I know it is not much, but I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town judges people by their blood. Diana felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you, she managed to say. That means more than you know. There were others in the crowd who looked less pleased, and Diana saw the ringleader from that first day glaring at them from across the street. But he made no move to approach or cause trouble, and Diana realized that perhaps things were changing, even if slowly. She and David had made a public declaration of their love and commitment, and while some would never accept it, others might eventually come around. They bought supplies in town and then headed back to the ranch, both eager to start their new life together. That night, Diana moved her belongings from the cabin to the main house, and she and David lay together in his bed, now their bed, talking until the fire burned down to embers. David held her close, and Diana felt safer and more loved than she had ever felt in her life. The winter was long and cold, but Diana had never been happier. She and David settled into married life with surprising ease, working together to keep the ranch running and planning for the future. They spent evenings by the fire, reading to each other from David's collection of books or making music together, Diana having discovered she had a decent singing voice to accompany David's guitar playing. They talked about everything, from the serious matter of how to expand the ranch to the silly question of what names they would give their future children. It was during one of those evening conversations that Diana first brought up an idea that had been forming in her mind. David, she said carefully, what would you think about offering work to other people like me? People who have been rejected because of their mixed heritage or because they are different in some way? David looked up from the piece of leather he had been working into a new bridle. I think that is a wonderful idea, he said. Why do you ask? Because I keep thinking about how lucky I was to meet you and how easily things could have gone differently. If you had not been there that day, if you had not offered me work, I do not know what would have become of me. I want to give other people that same chance. The ranch is not big enough right now to support more than just the two of us, David said thoughtfully. But if we work hard and expand, like we have been planning, there could be room for more people eventually. I like the idea of creating a place where people can come without fear of being judged or rejected. We could build a community, Diana said, warming to the idea. Not just a ranch, but a real home for people who need one. Let us make it happen, David said, pulling her into his arms. It will take time, but we will do it together. Spring came to the valley like a revelation, the snow melting to reveal green grass and wildflowers. Diana planted her garden with seeds David had bought on a trip to town, humming as she worked the soil and imagined the bounty it would bring. She also discovered she was pregnant, and the joy she felt at sharing that news with David was almost overwhelming. He had picked her up and spun her around, laughing like a child, and then become immediately anxious about whether she should be doing physical work. I am pregnant, not broken, Diana had told him firmly. My mother worked right up until the day I was born, and I will do the same. But I appreciate your concern. As her belly grew, so did the ranch. David hired a man named Miguel Rivera, a middle-aged Mexican ranch hand who had been blacklisted from most of the ranches in the area because of his heritage. Miguel was skilled with horses and cattle, and he brought his wife Rosa with him. Rosa was a small, energetic woman who quickly became Diana's closest friend, helping with the garden and the household chores as Diana's pregnancy advanced. Miguel and Rosa lived in the cabin Diana had first occupied, and the four of them often shared meals together, the house filled with laughter and conversation in both English and Spanish. Diana taught Rosa some of the Irish recipes her mother had made, and Rosa taught Diana how to make proper tortillas and tamales. The men worked together on expanding the herd and building additional structures, and the ranch began to transform from a simple homestead into a thriving operation. In September, Diana gave birth to a healthy baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's bronze skin. They named him Daniel, after Diana's father, and he became the center of their world. David proved to be a devoted father, doting on his son and taking him out to see the animals as soon as Diana would allow it. Miguel and Rosa were honorary aunt and uncle, and baby Daniel grew up surrounded by love and laughter. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The ranch continued to grow, and true to their vision, David and Diana created a haven for people who had been rejected elsewhere. They hired a Chinese couple who had been driven out of the mining camps, a young black man who had escaped violence in Texas, and a woman whose Apache heritage had made her unwelcome in white society. Each person brought their own skills and stories, and the ranch became a patchwork community of people who understood what it meant to be judged unfairly. Diana gave birth to two more children, a daughter they named Mary, after David's mother, and another son they called Thomas. The children grew up speaking both English and Spanish, eating tamales and Irish stew, learning to appreciate the richness that came from different cultures blending together. They were taught from an early age that blood did not determine worth, that people should be judged by their character and actions, not by heritage they could not control. The town of Silverton slowly changed as well. As more miners and ranchers saw the success of David's operation, some began to reconsider their prejudices. It helped that David was scrupulously honest in all his business dealings, and that his ranch consistently produced high-quality cattle and horses. Gradually, people who had once looked at Diana with contempt began to treat her with respect, even if some still harbored private reservations. The sheriff remained a staunch ally, and Mrs. Patterson became a regular visitor, bringing baked goods and gossip from town. There were still incidents, of course. Once, when Diana was in town buying supplies, a drunk man had made crude comments about her heritage. Before she could respond, 3 townspeople, including the general store owner, had intervened and told the man to leave. It was a small thing, but it showed how much had shifted in the years since that first confrontation on the main street. By the time Daniel was 10, Mary was 7, and Thomas was 5. The ranch had grown to over 500 acres with 200 head of cattle and a growing reputation for quality horses. David and Miguel had started a breeding program, crossing sturdy ranch horses with some of the beautiful Spanish horses Miguel's family had raised in Mexico. The resulting animals were intelligent, strong, and highly sought after, and David made sure to give Miguel full credit for his expertise. The community they had built was thriving, with 12 adults and 6 children living on the ranch property. They had built a small schoolhouse where Diana and Rosa taught the children reading, writing, and arithmetic, along with history that included perspectives often left out of traditional textbooks. They celebrated holidays from different cultures, and the children grew up understanding that diversity was something to be cherished, not feared. One evening, as Diana and David sat on their porch watching the sunset over the mountains, Diana reflected on how far they had come. "Do you remember the day we met?" she asked, taking David's hand. "Every detail," David said. "You were the bravest person I had ever seen, standing up to that mob even though you had just arrived in town and had no reason to put yourself at risk for a stranger." "I could not just walk away," Diana said. "It was not right what they were trying to do to you, and I could not walk away from you," David said. "The moment I saw you, something inside me just knew. I did not know it was love, not yet, but I knew you were important. I knew I wanted you in my life. They all rejected me for blood I did not choose," Diana said softly. "But you chose me without looking at blood at all. You saw me, really saw me, and that made all the difference." "You made the difference," David said, pulling her close. "You brought life and joy and purpose to this place. Before you, it was just land and animals and work. After you, it became a home and a family and a community. Everything good in my life stems from the day you stepped off that stagecoach." Diana kissed him, still feeling that flutter in her stomach, even after all these years. "I love you," she said, "for seeing me, for choosing me, for building this life with me." "I love you too," David said. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows we have left." The years continued to roll by, bringing both joy and sorrow as all years do. Miguel passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, and the entire community mourned him. Rosa stayed on, becoming a beloved grandmother figure to all the children on the ranch. Diana's eldest son Daniel grew into a fine young man who fell in love with and married the daughter of the Chinese couple, uniting their families even more closely. Mary became a teacher, taking over the schoolhouse and expanding it to accept students from town as well. Thomas inherited his grandfather's gift with horses and continued Miguel's breeding program with great success. David and Diana grew old together, their hair turning white and their hands becoming gnarled with age, but their love never diminished. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire community threw them a celebration, and people came from as far away as Denver to honor the couple who had created a place where everyone was welcome. The mayor of Silverton, a man young enough to have no memory of the old prejudices, gave a speech praising David and Diana for their contributions to the region and for being living examples of how love and acceptance could overcome hatred and fear. That night, as they lay in bed together, Diana traced the lines on David's face and marveled at how much their lives had changed. "We did it," she said. "We built something that will last beyond us." "You did it," David said. You had the vision. I just helped make it real. We did it together, Diana insisted. That is what made it work. Neither of us could have done it alone. David took her hand and kissed it, his lips soft against her wrinkled skin. Together, he agreed. Today, tomorrow, and for all the tomorrows we have left. They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had done for 40 years, and when Diana woke in the morning, she found David had passed peacefully in the night. The grief was crushing, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe, but even in her sorrow, Diana felt grateful. They had been given 4 decades together, 40 years of love and partnership, and building something meaningful. Not everyone was so blessed. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the impact David had made during his life. He was buried on a hillside overlooking the valley he loved, and Diana visited his grave every day, talking to him about the ranch and the family and all the little details of life she knew he would want to hear. Diana lived another 5 years after David's death, watching her grandchildren grow and welcoming great-grandchildren into the world. She continued to tend her garden and teach in the schoolhouse, and she made sure that the story of how the ranch had begun was passed down to every new generation. She wanted them to understand that the acceptance and love they took for granted had been hard-won, that their grandparents and great-grandparents had fought against prejudice and hatred to create this community. On a beautiful spring morning, with wildflowers blooming across the valley and the mountains standing eternal against the blue sky, Diana Calloway Eckhart passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 69. She was buried beside David, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives, along with an inscription that read simply, "They chose love." The ranch continued to thrive long after Diana's death, growing and changing with the times, but never losing the fundamental values she and David had instilled in it. It remained a place where people were judged by their character rather than their heritage, where hard work and kindness mattered more than bloodlines, and where love was always the most important thing. Generations of children grew up hearing the story of how their great-great-grandmother had been rejected by everyone for blood she did not choose, and how their great-great-grandfather had chosen her without looking at blood at all, and how that single act of seeing past prejudice had created a legacy that lasted far beyond their lifetimes. The story of Diana and David became legend in the San Juan Mountains, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But unlike most legends, this one was true in every important way. Two people had met in a moment of crisis, had recognized something essential in each other, and had chosen to build a life based on love and acceptance rather than hatred and fear. They had faced opposition and prejudice, but they had never wavered in their commitment to each other and to the community they were building. And in the end, their love had not just survived, but had flourished, creating ripples that spread far beyond their small valley and touched countless lives. In Silverton, the old hostilities eventually faded as the people who had harbored them died out and were replaced by new generations who had grown up with different values. The ranch that David and Diana had built became a model for others, proof that diversity and acceptance could lead to prosperity and happiness. Schools began teaching about the Eckharts as local heroes, people who had stood up for what was right even when it was difficult and unpopular. The house where David and Diana had lived was preserved as a historical site, maintained by their descendants, and open to visitors who wanted to see where the legend had begun. The simple furniture and handmade quilts were carefully protected, along with Diana's collection of herb jars and David's old guitar. The guest book filled up with names and comments from people all over the world who had been inspired by the story, many of them writing about their own experiences with prejudice and their hopes for a more accepting world. The valley itself remained much as it had been, the mountains standing eternal and the creek still running silver through the green grass. The cattle and horses still grazed in the pastures, and children still learned their lessons in the schoolhouse, though it had been expanded and modernized over the years. The cabin where Diana had first lived was maintained as a guest house, and newlyweds from the community sometimes spent their first night there, carrying on a tradition that honored the love story that had started it all. But perhaps the most important legacy of Diana and David Eckhart was not the ranch or the community or even the family they had created. It was the simple but profound idea that love could conquer prejudice, that people could choose to see past the superficial differences of heritage and blood to recognize the common humanity that connected everyone. It was the knowledge that one person's courageous act could ripple outward through time, inspiring others to make similar choices and slowly, gradually changing the world. In the end, that was what mattered most, not the land or the buildings or the wealth that had been accumulated over the generations, but the love that had started it all and continued to sustain it. Diana Calloway had arrived in Silverton alone and desperate, rejected by everyone who knew her heritage. David Eckhart had been a solitary rancher trying to build a life in the wilderness. Together, they had created something that neither could have achieved alone, something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes and touched more lives than they ever could have imagined. Their great-great-grandson, named David Daniel Eckhart, after both his ancestors, stood on the porch of the old house one evening as the sun set over the mountains. He was holding his newborn daughter, a beautiful baby with green eyes and bronze skin, who reminded everyone of the photographs they had seen of Diana in her youth. His wife, a woman of Japanese and Irish descent, stood beside him, and together they looked out over the valley that had been home to their family for generations. "I wish they could see this," his wife said softly. "Wish they could know what they started." "I think they do know," David Daniel said. "I think somehow they can see it all, can see how their love created all of this." He looked down at his daughter, who was sleeping peacefully in his arms. "We are going to tell you all about them," he promised her, "about how they met and fell in love, about how they stood up to hatred and built something beautiful. And we are going to teach you to carry on their legacy, to choose love over fear and acceptance over prejudice. That is the Eckhart way, and it always will be." The baby made a small sound in her sleep, and her parents smiled at each other. The sun finished setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The mountains stood silent and eternal, having witnessed it all, and the valley lay peaceful in the gathering dusk. The story of Diana and David had begun with rejection and chosen love, and it continued still, passed down through the generations, a reminder that the choices people made about how to treat each other mattered more than anything else. In the end, that was the real story. Not just about two people who fell in love despite prejudice, but about how that love had transformed them and everyone around them, creating a legacy that would endure as long as there were people willing to carry it forward. They had rejected her for blood she did not choose. The cowboy had chosen her without looking at blood, and from that single choice made in a moment of courage and compassion had come a future filled with hope and love and the unshakable knowledge that people were always more than the sum of their parts, always more than their heritage or their bloodlines. They were their choices, their actions, their love. And that was everything that mattered.